So the big news coming in from West Asia today, which is of course the death of Hamas chief Yahya Sinwar, who was killed by Israeli forces yesterday. Truly a massive development in the conflict, of course, and following on the deaths of Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah, as well as the Hamas political chief Ismail Haniyeh, which just happened over the course of the last few weeks and months. Joining me now is Kabir Taneja of the Observer Research Foundation, someone I'm sure you have grown used to seeing on the channel, to help us understand what's going on right now in West Asia and what Sinwar's death could possibly mean for the conflict in the Middle East. Kabir, thank you so much for joining us. Could you begin by let me ask you with the most basic question? Could you explain to us who Yahya Sinwar was? Why was he so important?
Well, just to begin with, Sinwar was very, very central to Hamas. He'd been part of Hamas for a good 30, 35 years, and was seen as sort of the main military commander of Hamas in Gaza, which is a very powerful position to be in. And his route to that infamy, for a lack of a better term, is also the fact that he spent about 2 decades in an Israeli prison. So he honed his understanding of Israel, Israeli security infrastructure, Israeli thinking, while being in very close proximity of the Israelis. That gave him really, really a very important niche within the Hamas system, which helped his rise within the Hamas hierarchy. So he was a very, very important figure, and of course, he was seen as the architect of the October 7th attack last year. So for Israel, getting him was a core aim, and the fact that it took 1 year to get there also shows that how deeply ingrained Hamas and Yahya Sinwar were within the Gaza Strip.
Could I ask you a little bit about the his death and where that leaves us right now in the conflict in West Asia? Of course, as you mentioned, that he was a major figure in Hamas. Hamas is also, of course, reeling after the death of its political chief Ismail Haniyeh. Why is his death significant? Where does that leave Hamas as a group at this point in time?
That's a very good question, actually. There is no sort of natural successor in my mind, at least, anymore. Now there are a lot of rumors swirling around that at least in Gaza, does Mohammed Sinwar, Yahya Sinwar's brother, take over, or politically, people like Khalid Mashal take over from where Ismail Haniyeh left. So these are very open-ended questions. It's very difficult to ascertain on how depleted Hamas is. If we don't hear about any succession plans over the next 2 months, 1.5, 2 months, it will basically show that a lot of the Hamas hierarchy has been depleted and they don't have natural successors anymore. So that means they will have to build that capacity once again. Now, how much of strength they have left to build that capacity also is depends on a variety of factors, including whether Arab states and Iran and so on and so forth actually aid Hamas in any shape or form to come up once again. If these kind of actors have decided that no, enough is enough, that ultimately Hamas needed to go for something else to come up within the Palestinian political systems, then Hamas may find it very difficult to conduct a resurgence. But finally, we have to see it from that perspective. Now, within the Palestinian system, there is a political and a military vacuum.
Right.
And who fills that is a very open-ended question. And that also means that you cannot discount the fact that Hamas, in this shape or another shape, still try to capture that space.
Could I ask you a little bit about where this leaves us with this conflict in the Middle East right now? I've read some of the analysis that's come in of Sinwar's death, and some experts have suggested that look, with Sinwar's death, you might get a new leader of Hamas who is more willing to strike a deal on things like hostages as well as a ceasefire with Israel. Do you buy that line of thinking that with Hamas?
That line of thinking was also promoted when Ismail Haniyeh died, right? Ismail Haniyeh was seen as a quasi-moderate person, sort of was much more inclined towards talks or towards negotiations and so on and so forth. Sinwar was a military commander. And the fact that Sinwar took over after Ismail Haniyeh also showed that within the political system and within the Hamas military system, there were disagreements on how to go forward. The military system in Gaza was the one really shedding blood for Hamas, right? And the political system was largely based out of Doha and had some incubation in Turkey and Egypt and so on and so forth. But the fact that Sinwar actually came up and said, like, after Ismail Hania, I will take over. That showed that they did not really buy into the whole idea of negotiations, moving towards peace, and they wanted to promote a military solution, which they started last year.
Right.
Now, where does that debate within Hamas go? I think barring maybe within Israel security systems, I think everyone will have to wait and watch. It's conjecture at best.
Yeah. You've said this is conjecture, but if I could ask you a little bit about this, there's been some conversation about, okay, mass amnesty for Hamas fighters, that if Hamas is so disorganized at this point in time, would it be possible for Arab nations as well as for the United States to help push for some sort of ceasefire? Where do you stand on this? Because I'm just pursuing this line of thinking with you that actually a peace deal is more possible now after Sinwar's death.
Look, the peace deal and amnesty deal don't have to coexist together, right? The problem with the amnesty deal from an Israeli point of view, and I'm just sort of putting myself in their shoes for this, is going to be that they've seen this movie before, right? Like, for example, as I said before, Yahya Sinwar was in an Israeli prison for 20 years. And he was released in 2011 as part of an exchange when Hamas had kidnapped one Israeli soldier. And in exchange, they got the Israel to release over 1,000 of Palestinians in general, but also a lot of pro-Hamas people. And within that was Yahya Sinwar. So, these kind of groups play a very, very long game. So my pertinent question right now is going to be or the biggest question will remain that what is going to be that political system that will sort of move into Gaza and make sure that there is some sort of stability which allows a level of reconstruction politically and economically, so that groups like Hamas cannot take over once again. But from an Israeli point of view, just let's say doing an amnesty deal and putting them in prison does not mean that that the Hamas or a similar group will not mobilize against that 20 years down the line or 10 years down the line.
Right.
Right. So the political stability part is directly attached to everything, including Israel's own security thinking on what happens in Gaza. And finally, this very quickly from an Israeli perspective, look, they will not want to be in a situation where the Israeli defense forces are bogged down in Gaza for the next 2-3 years. They've seen how that goes with the Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they will not want to repeat that. And I don't think they even have the capacity or the willingness. If you see some of the debates that came out a couple of months ago between the IDF and the Netanyahu government, IDF made it very clear that, look, we need a political track, that we don't want the military to be handling Gaza directly for the foreseeable future, because that's not tenable.
Right. If I could ask you to expand on that a little bit, right? Because I was going to ask you to move towards how Israel is looking at this. For our viewers, there's been some conversation that within the Israeli Defense Forces, there are generals who have a different view of how the conflict should progress, that there should be a more political track as well, that there is not a purely military solution to this conflict. So could I ask you, Kabir, again, some of the conversation after Sinwar's death was, is this a chance for Israel to declare victory and shift focus somewhat? Or do you believe, as some have suggested, that, look, Netanyahu's ability to have taken out now in short succession Hania, Hassan Nasrallah from Hezbollah, and Yahya Sinwar actually strengthens his position to take on a more offensive military policy, let's say, in Lebanon. What are you seeing as Israel's thinking? And could you explain some of the different strands of thinking in Israel about how the conflict needs to progress from here on out?
Yeah, I mean, look, that's a difficult question to answer. But if you see from Netanyahu's perspective as the Prime Minister of Israel, he's already made it clear yesterday that this is not end of the conflict. So any idea that Netanyahu is going to take half a step back or a full step back right now, look towards a political off-ramp and so on and so forth, I don't think that's going to happen. I think for the moment now that Yahya Sinwar has been eliminated, they will try to secure Gaza Strip properly, while also continue to move against Hezbollah in Lebanon. And I don't think that's going to change anytime in the near future. Now, if that's a good thing or a bad thing, difficult to say. But if you see the political reality from Netanyahu as well, and what his government constitutes of, the kind of thinking his government constitutes of, I think taking a step back right now will not find a lot of popularity within his coalition.
Right.
So he's also bogged down politically from that angle. let alone just militarily.
Right.
Hence, I think, like yesterday, he made it clear that in his statement that this does not mean that the war has been.
Right. Kabir, could I also ask you to expand a little bit on what I was mentioning earlier, a little bit about how certain sections of the Israeli defense forces, the Israeli military, believe that the Israel is not really taking the right path in this conflict, that there needs to be, as you were mentioning, a political component as well. Could you explain that type of thinking as well to sort of lay out for our viewers what an alternative approach to what Netanyahu is doing is that some people in the IDF are advocating for?
Yeah, I mean, look, the IDF has put its word out fairly simply, I think. Of course, we have to remember that the IDF is not going to take any parallel track to the political system, right? The army has to sort of take on the political decision makers and take orders from the political decision. You can't be seen as sort of going beyond the ken of what an army is supposed to be. But having said that, I think the IDF has, as I said before, also they've made it very clear that you know being in Gaza long term as the governing body in shape of the military is not sustainable. It's not something that the IDF wants to do, which is why it has pushed Netanyahu and his cohort to come up with political solutions so that they can hand over the victories that they have done kinetically through a political track. Where I think biggest concern is that after 1 year and 2 months, 3 months now, since October 7th, there is no political track on the table. And I think there will be increasing pressure on Netanyahu, along with the regional countries and even the international community, that the IDF will also say that, look, we are on board completely. We wanted to eliminate Ismail Haniyeh. We wanted to eliminate Yahya Sinwar. These are all political decisions, by the way. I think the Israelis would have militarily gamed this long ago. There's always the political green flag that needs to come in. And October 7th provided that, right? October 7th provided Israel to be unabashed about going after these characters, which they have done. But I think from the military point of view, this being responsible for something like Gaza on years on end will not be sustainable, specifically if they want to create a political system that is moderate in nature. Military boots on the ground, managing Gaza, managing a Palestinian population, will not create a moderate political system or a moderate societal system in any shape or form right now.
Right.
So that is, I think, IDF's core concern, that on the front line of things, that they will become they will be seen as the enemy, because no other political system led by Palestinians is coming and filling the vacuum.
Right. Could I ask you a little bit about, we've talked about the various regional, we've talked about Israel, we've talked about Hamas. Could I also ask you a little bit about how various regional powers will see this? Let's talk about Iran. Is there a sense that Iran will look at this with some dismay, that, a number of its, the leaders of its axis of resistance have been have been killed, their forces have been degraded? How is Iran going to be approaching things after the death of Sinwar? Do you think there's going to be any substantial change, or is their policy going to remain the same? So I think we've lost Kabir there very briefly, but we'll just get him back if we can.
Sorry, I dropped out.
Perfect. Yes, Kabir is back. Thank you, Kabir. So did you hear my last question, or should I just repeat it once more?
Could you repeat?
Right. So what I was saying was that, in terms of, I want to talk to you a little bit about the regional powers that are involved in this conflict. Could I ask you about how Iran is going to be looking at the death of Sinwar, and how the conflict has turned in the last couple of weeks and months, with the deaths of Nasrallah, with the death of Haniyeh, and now with the death of Sinwar? How are they going to be looking at all of this?
Look, I think the death of Yahya Sinwar was inevitable anyway. I don't think Iran will be very surprised or shocked of his passing. I think they were more shocked about Hassan Nasrallah's passing than Yahya Sinwar's. But from an Iranian point of view, look, they have taken a different strategy right now. They are loss of heads of their axis of resistance. It's something that maybe they think is replaceable. But what the Iranians are successfully doing right now is actually going around the Middle East, including to Saudi Arabia, to Oman, to Lebanon, to any number of countries, to basically create this argument that we need to push together against Israel for them to stop in Gaza. And I think they are finding some success there. They're finding diplomatic success there. Right? They pushed Saudi Arabia in a corner where Saudi Arabia on record had to come out and say, look, we will not normalize anything with Israel until there is a two-state solution track on the table. Earlier, I think the Saudis were very much more closer to normalizing with Israel than they are now, and the Iranians have managed to seeing Saudis' own situation on how they don't want to get embroiled in a larger conflict. They played that hand pretty well. So while the direct losses within the axis of resistance is something that that would be expected at some level. The fact that diplomatically they still seem to be making decent ground is where I think most of the eyes need to be kept at.
Right. And if I could ask you in terms of the regional nations, the GCC countries, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and so on, what is their reaction to this going to be? Some suggestions, of course, that they will step up their efforts for an end to this conflict. How do you think regional Arab countries will see this?
Look, on the GCC countries, you have to remember none of them really came out in support of Hamas by itself. Right. Yeah. They are worried about the civilian losses, and they're very worried about the civilian losses because within their own populations, it's not going to be seen as very palatable what Israel is doing, but it is also not going to be seen as very palatable the fact that the Arab nations are not doing enough. So now you are seeing, for example, the UAE and Saudi sending regular tranches of aid to both Lebanon and into the first, I think, couple of trucks went in yesterday into Gaza after a very long time. So they are also in a difficult situation, right? Ultimately, from a security point of view, degraded Hamas and Hezbollah in the region works for the Arab states as well. It's not just for Israel that it works, and for them, it's also good that Israel was forced to do the dirty work in degrading these kind of groups in the region. But of course, coming back to my original point, this only works for anyone and everyone if the alternatives that come after after specifically in the Palestinian politics are moderate in nature. Now, how do you make sure that they will be moderate in nature? That is, I think, the blueprint that no one has any answers to. So
right.
Unless we have answers to that, I think everyone is playing it situationally right now and not strategically yet, because the space for long-term thinking is very, very limited.
Right. And if I could close off this by asking you the question about, of course, Washington, D.C. and how the Americans are going to look at this. Of course, an election looming now in America in just a matter of weeks. What will Washington be aiming for? What is Joe Biden's administration hoping to do in the time that it has left?
I don't think Joe Biden will be doing anything, to be honest. He's got 25 odd days left in office. He's not going to do anything that is going to sully his legacy or further sully his legacy or anything of that sort. Israel has a very open window till the new US president comes into play. They know that there will be very little pressure beyond the point, and even whatever little pressure comes from Biden, they can sort of see through it. The US has not really closed the taps on providing military aid, so that works for Israel. Without US military aid, they will not be able to do most of the things they're doing right now.
Right.
But what happens after that, it's difficult to say. I mean, at one point, there's a probability that Kamala Harris will, if she wins, will continue similarly to Biden's foreign policy track. And the other hand is Donald Trump comes, who's a very transactional and erratic leader. Even Israel, beyond the point, would not know how to best navigate that. So, but in the next 20-25 days, they've had this window for a while now, where the election has paralyzed American foreign policy actions. And if you see right now, Israel has really gone and done what it wanted to without minimal political pressure coming from that.
Right. Kabir, let me ask you one final question. Just, something that's been bandied about a lot, of course. Just very recently, of course, I think it was yesterday that Italy's Prime Minister announced an arms embargo on Israel. Of course, the key player when it comes to military supplies to Israel is the United States. I just wanted to ask you, how crucial is that continued supply of American military aid to Israel? If, for example, if I were just to paint a scenario for you, if Netanyahu were to take a more aggressive military posture and say that, look, we're in this to win, we're in this to reshape the Middle East in an image that we prefer, and let's say Kamala Harris wins the election and chooses to place an arms embargo, how sustainable is an aggressive Israeli military policy without American support? Just for the purpose of our audience.
It's not very sustainable. Yeah, it's not very sustainable for them. They need the U.S. pipeline of arms and ammunition and defense infrastructure to keep on coming for them to continue on this. You have to remember, Israel is a very small country. And even if you see some of the reports coming in right now, the U.S. is already saying that they're struggling to continue delivering arms to both Ukraine and Israel at the same time. because their own sort of defense industrial complex is not the same as what used to be earlier. So without the U.S. Military tap, the proverbial tap of supplies, the Israelis will find it extremely difficult to continue the way they have been doing that.
Understood. Kabir Taneja from the Observer Research Foundation joining us, and just in a matter of 15 20 minutes explaining to you who Yahya Sinwar was, what the implications of his death are, and how every single major player in this conflict is going to be looking at the death of Sinwar and where that leaves the conflict in West Asia. Kabir, thank you so much for joining us. I'm obliged to you for always making time to speak to us on the show, and thank you, viewers, for watching India Today Global.